Prison as Hades, recovering the early church's mission in the age of mass incarceration. So my attempts here are going to be to connect, on one hand, how an argument that mass incarceration is at the center of today's injustices, especially in the United States of America. Thankfully, it's becoming more and more mainstream awareness that the United States is out incarcerating any country in the world, including China and Iran and Russia and all those places we think is very carceral and cold-hearted. We are out incarcerate everyone, like head and shoulders above, and we incarcerate more human beings than any nation in the history of the world. So we're talking about just global historical precedent. Incarceration is the greatest crisis, I think, of our time. And it's one that overlaps and accelerates so many other things about racism, poverty, housing, healthcare. I think incarceration is kind of like the heart of the beast. So I want to connect that with my kind of theological journey over the last 10 or 12 years of rediscovering the center of the Christian salvation narrative. For me, it was a lot of atonement story stuff. I grew up in a very conservative, evangelical American salvation narrative that had to do a lot with the cross and Jesus taking the punishment that we deserved. It's really a criminal justice kind of salvation story. We are criminals. We deserve ultimate cosmic incarceration, to be sent to a dark, horrible place and be punished eternally, an eternal life sentence. And that Jesus got the kind of death penalty that we deserved from judge and warden and executioner God. And so he got that punishment for us, so we kind of get pardoned and get to hang out with the warden eternally. That's the kind of story I think a lot of us have known, especially if we've grown up in a Protestant evangelical salvation story. That's called the penal substitutionary atonement theory. And as I've gone deeper and deeper into the history of the church, and how did the early church understand how Jesus saves us? What is the salvation drama? I found it fits really well with the prison context. So here we go. This is a passage that's been really important to me since I got into the kind of jail ministry and working among gang members that I described yesterday. The founding of the church. The first time the word church is used in the New Testament, in Matthew, in the first gospel. Here it is. Jesus is hanging out with his posse, his homies, and he looks at Simon, but Simon has a street name, which is Rock. So you've got a guy with a second street name, a tough secondary name, says, look, I tell you, Rock, on this rock I'm going to build my ecclesia. And it's so hard. We've had 2,000 years of what is church, so many associations, the building, Christians, Christendom. So this is like ecclesia, the Greek word, even though Jesus was speaking in Aramaic. On you I build my ecclesia, whatever this is. And here is the first sentence which defines whatever the ecclesia is. And the gates of Hades will not prevail against it. So the founding imagination that Jesus has with whatever church is, it's something that is aiming towards Hades. What's Hades? Hades in the Greek imagination is the underworld, death. We could say hell today. The gates of hell will not prevail against it. So whatever the church is, it's something that is not a building, because he says, on you, Peter, I build this rock. And so if it's a building, that's a death sentence to build a building on top of him. So it's not a building. On you I build my ecclesia, my assembly, my movement, my posse. And whatever it is, it's something that has a trajectory aimed somewhere. The church is an arrow with a point. Where is it headed? Towards the gates of Hades. So the church isn't something... I won't finish that sentence. The church is something that is aimed towards the gates of Hades. This is the early church's salvation drama. The more I've been studying orthodoxy in the early church, there's so much, it's hard to just look at text. There's so many icons. Elisa, are you praying or raising your hand? I'm praying. All right. So if you look at many of the icons in the early church, this is one of the most common ones. There's so many iterations of it. Can you see what's beneath Jesus' feet there?
Place of the dead.
What's that?
Place of the dead.
Place of the dead. Sorry, it's a little fuzzy. Yeah, it's dark. It's kind of like an underworld. All the little, those little white things around, those aren't stars. Those are keys and locks.
Oh.
And these are people coming out of tombs, and they're the dead even further below. And see those, look, I'm going to practice using this. I didn't know I had it yesterday. Oh. See that right there? You'll see those throughout. I'll show you more icons. There's always this kind of like, they look like little French doors, kind of crisscross between Jesus' feet. These are the gates of Hades. So this was central in the salvation drama, much more than the cross, which came in later centuries as the central image. So much in the first 4 or 5 centuries, this is it. Christ triumphant, rising out of the underworld, where the barrier between the living and the dead is crushed. The gates are broken and crumpled under his feet, and the locks and the keys are scattered everywhere, and people coming out of the tombs are rising. This is the understanding of Christus Victor. So Hades, I like that image. In the Greek imagination, that was the name for the underworld, the realm of the dead. It wasn't necessarily punishment in the way that hell we think about now. Everyone went to Hades. And sometimes Hades is even personified, like Hades the person, in the kind of the Greek imagination and the songs and the hymns of, death speaking back and saying, no, I want to hold on to my dead, and him at war with Jesus who invades his walls and steals all of his slaves and steals all of his people in Hades. And Hades is at war. Death is at war with the living God. So Peter, remember the same guy that said this movement would be built on him, that would not be defeated by the gates of Hades. He then writes in his letter in 1 Peter, he has the same imagination of this trajectory of the church and of Jesus. For Christ also suffered, he writes, for sins once for all, the righteous for the unrighteous, in order to bring you to God. He was put to death in the flesh, but made alive in the spirit, in which he went and made a proclamation to the spirits in prison. Remember Gracie pointed this out to me like 8 years ago. And we were like, yeah, I never heard that growing up. Did you guys hear this story growing up? That when after Jesus died on the cross, his descent continued into the underworld, and the very alive God descended to the realm of the dead and continued to preach his good news. That this isn't a God that sends people to heaven or accepts people into heaven or sends people punitively to hell. This is a God who descends into our hell and then goes deeper and deeper into the deeper hells that we've never known, preaching the good news to the bottom of the earth and then to raise us all up with him. Is this news? Is this kind of imagination or this text kind of new? Show of hands if this idea is kind of new. Awesome. Well, Peter says it again in case we missed it in the same letter. In chapter 4, verse 6. For this is the reason the gospel was proclaimed even to the dead. So this understanding of Jesus descending to the dead to bring his good news, his proclamation, him invading a prison breaking into a cosmic prison to bring his good news. This is Peter's imagination on whom the church was founded. So this is some of the iconography we have from this really ancient stuff of him bringing the good news and preaching the good news of the living God and his love even among the dead. Here it is. This is an ancient Byzantine mosaic. See the gates of Hades once again? It's always there. The gates of Hades, the keys, the locks, busted. And he is triumphant in the cross. Like the electric chair is a trophy for him. It's something that does not dominate him, but he holds and he wields, almost like the scalp of an enemy. He holds the cross. The cross doesn't save us. It's a symbol of his victory over death. This is a book that's been really helpful and encouraging to me as a prison chaplain. Like the whole time I'm reading this book, I'm thinking about prison, which we'll get to in a minute. It's called Christ the Conqueror of Hell. It's the current Archbishop in Russia, Hilarion Alfayev. The descent into Hades from an Orthodox perspective. And so this book is just loaded with this narrative of Christ the Conqueror of Hell, the invader of hell, in early church's letters, in hymns, in liturgy. So the Orthodox Church holds what we hold in the New Testament canon among a much larger canon of hymns and liturgy. It's called the Kerygma, the theme of Christ preaching in Hades. So that's kind of the historical term for it, the Kerygma, Christ descending and preaching in Hades. This is the kind of the theology, I think, of jail and prison ministry, the Kerygma. Just a few examples. I could do a whole presentation on this book. I love it. From the teachings of Sylvanus, survived Coptic translation, 2nd century, pretty soon after New Testament writings. He says, know who Christ is. Being God, became man for your sake. It is this one who broke the iron bars of the underworld and the bronze bolts. He brought up the poor from the abyss and mourners from the underworld. It is he who humbled the haughty powers. More, Orthodox liturgy, still for 2,000 years, on the Sunday of the Veneration of the Cross, they sing, "Come, let us sing a new song as we celebrate the overthrow of hell." For me, this is much better news to proclaim if we're going to be talking about hell. Hell is a place that people already know, and we proclaim a living God who has overthrown it, and who continues to. For Christ has risen from the tomb, capturing death and saving the whole universe. The author himself, he writes, "After Christ's descent into Hades, there came a turning point in the destiny of hell. Christ filled it with his presence."
Wow.
That's what we're about. The destiny of hell changed with the descent of Christ. It is a place that is threatened by and invaded by God's wonderful presence. Again, he writes about the Gospel of Nicodemus, pretty early church, 1st and 2nd century. He says, "Christ destroys the, quote, chains, the bars, the seals, the gates, the stronghold of hell." He's just pointing out this imagery, this language in the early church. All these images reflect an understanding of hell as a prison that was impossible to escape from until Christ's victory over Hades and his abolition of the devil's power. So devil is kind of seen as death, devil, warden, stronghold, the one that keeps the walls of Hades intact. That we, with Christ and the church, we are breaking down. So that's the central motif of salvation, that Christ breaks the gates and bars of Hades. He robs Satan. The treasures are us. That he shines his light into death and opens a way for the dead back to life and into paradise with him. This is the central, if you're a Christian, you went to church probably on Easter all growing up, and different pastors kind of like warm up for their big Easter sermon to try to give what the salvation story is to people who only come to church on Easter. If you go to an Easter service at an Orthodox church, which I tried the last 2 years, it's kind of a drag in the sense that it goes on for hours. It starts about after dinner the night before, and they go all night and all through the morning. And this is what you will hear over and over and over, probably 150 times. They just chant into you, "Christ is risen from the dead, trampling down death by death, and upon those in the graves bestowing life." You guys want to try it? "Christ is risen from the dead, trampling down death by death, and upon those in the graves bestowing life." Chink, chink, chink. The incense goes everywhere. You're standing, you wish you could sit down 7-8 hours in. "Christ is risen from the dead, trampling down death by death, and upon those in the graves bestowing life." Orthodox Christians for years who couldn't read or write, this is what they knew. This is what was hammered into them. This was the proclamation, the good news, that this is what the Christian story is. I get to go to a Campus Crusade conference in October, and they invited me to speak. And they said there would be a workshop on how to share the gospel in like 1 or 2 minutes with campus students. And I said, "Can I be part of that, please?" So I'm looking forward to that. It's a very different salvation story than I think Campus Crusade told. Where were the gates of Hades in Jesus' time? So if this was in Jesus' time, when he says to Peter, "On you, rock, I build my ecclesia, and the gates of Hades will not prevail against it."
Were they the dung heap outside Jerusalem?
That's Gehenna.
Oh, that's Gehenna.
I think it's not one place, but it's an imagination. But it's an imagination to, it's like if we said the streets. Well, where was the streets in Jesus' time? It's not one place. That's kind of a shorthand for a kind of a social location, an existential location. This is how I understand it. And so literally, the most literal way to interpret this is there was a place called the Gates of Hades. It was in Caesarea Philippi. It was a Roman temple. So this is still a Greco-Roman world, and Jesus is playing on the images that are in his time. The Gates of Hades, in this temple, they proclaimed there's a temple built up in front of this rock, and this goes way down. It's a cave with kind of a river in it. They understood that as a portal to the underworld. But I think the realm of death was much closer to them as well. We see Jesus doing this in his ministry. In Mark 5, when his boat pulls up to the outskirts of the Gerasene area. And there's all those tombs, and it's a cemetery. And that's where they find this person who's bound up and tormented, totally captive to the powers of death, walking among the dead in a kind of half-life existence. I think this is a way that Jesus is enacting his whole mission, that he is going to the gates of Hades. He's going where nobody goes, and he breaks the bonds both spiritually and physically, chains and his demonic torment and exclusion going on. Where else? Certainly Golgotha, the place of the skull, the place of death, where in the Roman Empire people were thrown to the outer darkness. Jesus surely does this. He has his eyes set upon Jerusalem and towards the cross, the gates of Hades, the entryway to death. So where are the gates of Hades today? This is oftentimes, I've preached on this a few times at some churches, and it's good to hear for folks in different communities. Where are the gates of hell in your communities? Where is the portal of the underworld of death, where death reigns?
Crack houses.
Crack houses. Where are the gates of Hades, where the church has yet to invade?
Mental illness.
Mental illness? Crack houses, mental illness. What else? Where are the gates of Hades for you? Okay. Family court. Some could say even just courthouses. Oftentimes that's the beginning of the being sentenced and going deeper and deeper into a kind of social underworld. Courthouses.
Yeah, obviously maximum security prisons.
Maximum security prisons. The gates of Hades. Think about it. Hospitals. Homeless shelters.
The stroll.
Military. And what did you say?
The stroll. Kitty stroll.
Kitty stroll?
Stroll. Prostitute stroll. Street
Oh, okay.
track.
Is that a street in specifically?
No, it's just
This is what you call a place where prostitution
Stroll?
is happening.
Man, I'm out of it. I've never heard that. Okay, a place where prostitution is active. Okay.
Neighborhoods where
Stroll.
sex offenders live.
What's that?
Neighborhoods where sex offenders live. Where
Neighborhoods where sex offenders live?
Yeah, large communities of sex offenders.
Where they're kind of relegated to a kind of ghetto and people don't go. Okay. And so my thought is, if the church doesn't know where the gates of Hades are in Jesus' imagination, then the church doesn't know where it's going today. I think there's a lot of movement of the church realizing it's kind of lost. Do we go back to and reclaim a lot of our tradition and liturgy? Do we become an emergent church? Do we need to redefine church? There's a lot of really popular movements and books about reimagining church. That's always looking very cool and looking very much like people today. But I think this is the founding imagination of church, is that the whole point is it is supposed to invade the gates of Hades, and it cannot keep the church out, whatever the church is. So if we don't even know where the gates of Hades are, we don't know where we're going as a church. So where you're naming these places, I don't think, this is my argument, this is something just for transformational ministry on the margins. I think that's what the whole church is supposed to be about. And we get to be closer to the vanguard of that and invite the rest of the church into this exciting mission. So for me, the gates of Hades, as someone who's been a chaplain at the jail for years with folks at Tierra Nueva, I can't help but think of the literal prison system, mass incarceration I was talking about earlier. The U.S. prison system. So here's just, we could do a whole presentation on all the stats on this, and I decided not to do all that. Just a few talking points. U.S. prison as social death. There's been some books I'm reading. They talk about social death as being, you don't really exist in terms of voting, in terms of being a citizen. You are away from your family and from your friends. You're kind of considered dead in a way. You're not there for your kids, whether you're a man or a woman. So it's a kind of social death, away from the land of the living. You're disposable, forgotten. I've had guys tell me about, man, this is the land of the dead right here. When I visit someone in prison, they said, no one remembers us. And it's a place that's certainly ruled by evil. I mean, it kind of all the exaggerations of the world, of pride, of power, of dominance, of exploitation, of cruelty, of deceit. All those things of the world of the devil are kind of accelerated in this underworld of the prison life. I'm sure maybe you can imagine just from any TV shows or movies you've seen, such dog-eat-dog cruelty and lack of safety going on. And remember the Hades imagination, in the Greek imagination, you could communicate sometimes with the dead. And so I don't think it's too much of a stretch to talk about the kind of half-life, someone that's still conscious, their souls are still alive in Hades, but they're in a place of conscious torment. That is a really great way of talking about prison. A few stats on U.S. mass incarceration. Right now, these are old numbers, 2.3 million people incarcerated in the United States. There's a 500% growth just in the last 30 years since the drug laws changed in the 70s and the 80s and with Reagan. I mean, just look at those numbers. So this is really a problem. This is an incarceral epidemic, unprecedented in world history and U.S. history. Really important book at the center of the anti-mass incarceration movement, a book written by Michelle Alexander called The New Jim Crow. She's arguing specifically that not only is this an incarceration epidemic, but this is American slavery 2.0, and that there's way more people incarcerated today than there were in slavery 100 years ago in America. And that incarceration is way disproportionately like if blacks are about between 12 and 14% of America, they're like 70, 80% of those incarcerated. She talks about there's an underground kind of class upon release, and that's the title of Jim Crow. That after slavery, there was still kind of Jim Crow. People were second-class citizens. They oftentimes couldn't vote. They were stuck in certain neighborhoods. There was no social mobility. They were stuck, even though they weren't literally slaves. She says this is just the new Jim Crow. Even when people get out of prison, once you have a felony, you can't vote, you can't have a job, and then you just go right back to the social dumpster. And this is like way bigger than Jim Crow ever was, is her argument. And so she calls for an underground railroad. Remember that language from slavery? When churches and abolitionists, they created these, maybe this is a good way to jump on what Bob was saying yesterday about if there is some kind of ethic of bending the rules. That's what abolitionists definitely did. They became places of refuge for people running out of slavery, and that was kind of a new Exodus imagination they had. And the churches should always be, I think, on the forefront, because this is, if we're reading our Bibles, this is the story we get, Old and New Testament, this kind of Exodus, freedom for from the captives. And so she calls for what is the new underground railroad today? What are underground informal networks and collaborations between churches and organizations helping smuggle people out of a system of death? So how does the church today face the gates of Hades? For me, it was getting involved in Little County Jail here in Skagit County. There's thousands of counties across America, and counties or municipalities in different countries. But I was thinking about, the jail really is the gates of Hades. If the prison system is Hades, the jail, everyone has to go through a jail to get into prison. And every county, your local city has a jail. These are folks who are right in the gate, the entryway, the threshold into hell. This is such a great place to begin to engage your social Hades. Yeah?
Are you talking more like metaphorically speaking?
Absolutely.
All right, because I was sitting here I was like, hell isn't in this plane. I could see that being the way a lot of people get there. But I understand what you're saying now.
Yeah, my argument is that Jesus isn't just talking about an afterlife place when your heart stops ticking, but that Jesus in his ministry embodies it is both in the land of living and beyond death.
Because their soul's connected to hell at that point because they don't have Christ's blood on them. Is that what you're saying?
Sure. Yeah, that this is both in the realm of the living and in the realm of the dead. Just like the kingdom of heaven is in the realm of life and beyond when our heart stops ticking. That this is life and death. It's an eternal spiritual reality. And so there's the gates of Hades and literal death, as Jesus raised literal people from the dead, and he literally died and went to the literally dead. But he was also doing this throughout his ministry. And his charge to Peter in what the church is supposed to be, I think, is not just about an afterlife reality, but it was charging very real disciples into a real, very movement. And he uses the language, gates of Hades, to talk about a spiritual reality in our world today. That's what I'm trying to argue. So where does that in every town, in every country? And here, in the United States, for me, I'm focusing on prison and jail specifically as the gates of Hades. So through jail chaplaincy, that is truly the gates of the system, as I'm arguing. That is where, as Jesus descends to the dead, where we proclaim the word and the good news. where we read the Bible together, where there's song, where there's worship, where church is something that happens there. We're not just kind of doing church in jail, and that the real thing is in a church service on a Sunday morning. So I think that is the church invading the gates of Hades with proclamation, with joy, with prayer, with connection with God, with bringing God's life and word. And so I like how these images go together. Remember that old image of Christ coming among the dead and proclaim the good news? I see that as synonymous with what we do here and so many ministries do, doing Bible studies in lockdown settings. So in jail chaplaincy is also about visitation, visiting the dead, being with the dead, the way Jesus was literally. He didn't just stay on the outside and cast in his words. He died himself and went to the dead. So as jail chaplains, we get to be among the dead, enter Hades, and see Jesus bring people to life. I think that's one of the biggest joys that people get who get hooked on jail chaplaincy, prison chaplaincy. So people don't get it until they actually go in with you, right? And then they get the bug. I think that's where people feel so connected to God, because I think that's where Jesus is really active. Totally in line with his initial founding statement, I think. But then folks get shipped off to prison. And I've been surprised as I've got to travel a little bit this last year and talk about jail chaplaincy. Most people confuse the words jail and prison. They see them as synonymous.
Yeah.
They're just like, ChrisHoke, prison chaplain. I was like, no. You know, tearing away about that. They do a lot of prison chaplaincy. Like, yeah, we do, but mostly we're in the jail. They go, oh, what's the difference? Here's the difference. So for how many of you is jail and prison kind of still synonymous in your head? Don't really know the difference. Okay, I just want to run through it really quickly. The jail is where you go when you're arrested. It's local. Jails are local, oftentimes in a county in America. Jail's right there downtown. It's right there in the center of your community. It's short term, and oftentimes people, while they're there, they're awaiting sentence. They're not doing hard time. They're not sitting there for a long time. They're awaiting sentence. And the whole purpose is to detain people and to hold them short term. Then once they're sentenced, they get shipped off to prison. And these are not local. These are scattered throughout the state, oftentimes in very remote places, oftentimes in agricultural areas that are drying up. Communities are now begging for private companies to build a prison in their area for jobs. So they're in remote areas, and that's where people are doing hard time, years and years that they were sentenced to. And the name of the game there is not awaiting your sentence, but just survival. And that's where people can really shut down. So I think doing jail chaplaincy is really exciting because folks are still kind of like really dilated spiritually. Their hearts are really open, whereas folks in prison are just trying to survive. And they feel very threatened by something that would invite them to open their hearts. So these are warehouses, human warehouses, and it's all about punishment. And that's where I think that the imagination of the underworld among the dead, Hades, really applies. So I want to tell a story now. This is a folk. This is one of the folks, a friend of mine, that really impacted my life and who I write about the most in my book. Richard was a gang member. He ended up in our county jail. He was in our Bible studies for 2 whole years, and oftentimes folks we get to know the most are those facing murder charges. Because if you're facing a murder charge, you're not going to plea out. You're normally going to go to trial, and that takes forever. So folks who stay in jail for a long time are normally fighting a long, dragged-out trial. And so Richard was facing murder in the first. And it's a longer, complicated story, but it was an 83-year-old woman. And when he was on the run from police on a long, extended meth high, being one of Washington State's most wanted for about 2 or 3 weeks on the run, he knocked on a door of an old woman in Clare Thorpe, and he asked for her keys to her car because the cops were after him, and he was in a really panicked, methed-out state. And she said she'd reach for the phone. She wanted to help him. He freaked out because every time a phone is picked up to call for him, he gets arrested. He rushes and tries to put the phone down. It just knocks her over. Her hip cracks against the couch. He eventually leaves. She's 83 years old, in the hospital for 3 months. Her hip does not heal. In the meantime, she contracts pneumonia. She dies in the hospital. His charges of evasion and running go to murder in the first.
I remember that.
Here locally?
Yeah, it's right before I went into jail myself.
Did you meet Richard?
No, I was in Whatcom County Jail for about 6.5 months.
Okay. Richard eventually went off to prison after 2 years of visiting I visited him a lot. He was a very flamboyant, lively, intelligent leader of our Bible studies that oftentimes totally took control from me of the Bible study and bossed people around about acting out the banquet parable, and would with very colorful language like Neener's yesterday, argue with me about what was really going on, but he really saw good news that God maybe is as cool as Jesus, and that Jesus likes some other efforts like him. And that was good news to him. And so he would oftentimes try to translate what I was trying to say to make sure everyone else got how cool it was. Richard eventually got sent off to prison. I exchanged letters with Richard. But within about 14 months, Richard died. 26 years old, died in a first world prison. He literally rotted to death. We talk about rotting in prison as a kind of just a phrase of, throw away the key, let him just rot in prison. That happened to this man that I know in less than a year. This is the realm of death for us. The last letter I got from him, he was wandering in an American hell out in Washington State Prison at Walla Walla State Penitentiary. He was writing, if the world is a reflection of God, as how most people think, that everything happens for a reason, and their street theology is just a hyper-sovereign God that controls everything. So if he is having a horrible life like this, he assumes that God hates him. He said, if God doesn't give an F about me, then why should I give an F about, and I thought that he'd say, why should I give an F about God? But he said, why should I give an F about me either? And that was almost the last sentence, the last letter I got from him. And then I didn't know that while he was writing that, witnesses later, other guys locked up, wrote testimonies that he was like screaming out in pain for about 3 or 4 days as this necrotizing fasciitis, a kind of gangrene, was rotting him out throughout his entire system in a rash. He was like burning from the inside out and rotting in a prison. And he was denied medical access, was not allowed to call a medical emergency. The doctor said, I don't have time for those guys. He was golfing that weekend. And then when he came in, he was given the one thing that he's allergic to, and the only thing on his file, penicillin. And so he died within 24 hours after he was given that. So this is, for me, a very literal experience of hell in our time, and it demands a theological response. If the church and our central proclamation of hope can't overlap with this, what good is it? So not just Richard, but there's so many guys that I get to write prison letters with, and that's one of my greatest laments. And as I get busier and busier in ministries, I don't have enough time to continue to write the folks who are locked up in there. And writing letters with those in prison, I think, is one of the greatest things Christians can do who can't get access to be a chaplain, to be an approved chaplain. And even if you are, you can't write letters with them, right?
Right. Can I say one thing about that?
Yeah.
A prisoner told someone once that a letter is better than a visit.
So
A letter is like a visit every day.
You can reread it.
You reread it.
Yeah, I found that, especially as I was visiting Neener's, he would ask me to bring his daughter. It took, after like $60 of gas or more to a far end of the state, a whole day, the cost of ferry rides, the cost of eating the overpriced Coca-Colas and chips and microwave cheeseburgers that are about like $8 each in the vending rooms. And then when we'd sit there in the visits, oftentimes it's in a big room, and we couldn't really have a deep conversation because there's so many distractions, and he's got guards walking everywhere and all these inmates that if they see him being weak, that compromises his status in the community when visits over. And so I oftentimes felt, man, why am I coming out and doing these visits? I'd rather just write letters. Which is, again, like as I was saying yesterday, letter writing is so foundational to New Testament fellowship. And so letters, especially letters in between incarcerated worlds and out, I think is something for us to really prioritize, is prison letters. And so it's something I would like to do more of, is connecting folks that are still in prison with other members in our community, with other church folks. Like Neener's was one of the only guys I've done this with, but I started getting my family and friends writing him. And he loved it. All the kind of like overly loving XXO cards from my mother. But like I've kind of hit my toxic limit with the kind of like loving motherly cards that I got. I was blessed. I got so much, but I just started saying, "Hey, Mom, write Neener's," and just filling his cell with that much love. He loves it. He always defends my mom against Neener. It's like, dude, your mom's cool. So you guys heard the story yesterday about when Neener's in solitary confinement, once again pressing even deeper into Hades, into the underworld, with what the church is about. For me, that's such a beautiful vision of how relational contacts from churches, through us to Tierra Nueva, to Nieners, and Nieners reaching people who are like the most dead, the most forgotten in solitary confinement cells who no one remembers or writes for weeks on end. They have no contact other than a guard pushing food through their tray. That if there's some kind of ministry that was happening even through Nieners and the whole connected with the church, for me that is not just a neat metaphor. For me that is most literal and exciting incarnation today of what church can be. Defying the gates of Hades at every level of the gates. The church is defying them. I want to switch to Guatemala a little bit right now to see outside of just Skagit County and Washington, the way we see this even in other countries. There's a community down there that we've become connected to. You probably saw this guy. They've taken some good photos. His name, I think, is Monster. I don't know his real name. It might be Ernesto. But then look from that picture to that picture. Once you get inside Hades, oftentimes the people who become the specters that are so scary to society become really gentle, and you don't even see those tattoos. I love that picture. You hardly even, you see the tattoos, but you just see just a gentle guy hanging out there with a computer engineer who got involved with their prison chaplaincy. He was just showing him some photos. An ex-gang member there, Ignacio, he really wanted to show these guys, look, I see you as human beings, not animals. I want to bring my wife and my kids. We can't do that today in prison chaplaincy, but I think it's such a great embodiment of what the church is about. The whole church inhabiting, like Christ's presence coming, the destiny of hell turning to a place that is filled with God's presence. That he brings his little kid, he brings his wife to say, look, I'm not afraid of you. Here's my wife, you're my kids. I want them to know you. I want to hang out with you. We painted the walls. This is an overthrow of hell in a very small way. To go into hell and not just say, we just want to get you out, but even before you get out, we want to gut hell and fill it with God's presence. We want to turn this into a place where the kingdom of heaven grows and thrives, where there's painting. The story of the prodigal son is what they're painting there. Where the church comes, where there's music, where there's painting, where there's art, where there's meals.
We had a tent city happening in one of the parks in the downtown east side. And there was threat, like the police were coming to move everyone out of that tent city.
Mm-hmm.
And so there was like legal people kind of walking around the outside just to have eyes on the situation. And because the police were coming, we didn't know if it would be violent, we didn't know how it was going to happen or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
I just remember standing on the edge and there were these like bin fires or whatever, fires in the whatever, and I just looked and it was just like there was people everywhere and like police, and I was like, whoa, what, like just like, this is kind of scary. But then myself and a friend went closer, and it was like, these are just people. Stood by the fire and just looked around, and these are just people. So it's like, the fear comes from looking from the outside, but immerse yourself, and it's like,
Yeah, absolutely. I think when there's an exchange there, that's a kind of gates of Hades. That's a kind of a netherworld of the socially dead, where a community can kind of stick folks in a tent city, and for the church to come there and be with people with their presence. Not just bringing something, hey, here's a sandwich, here's a blanket. Those are all good, but the best ministries are really about incarnating God's love. Be like, I'm so glad to be here with you. Where they feel God's delight for them and not fear of them. We got to play some music and be in there. So all of these kind of ministries are what inspire me. I've realized as I go back to this early church understanding of the descent into Hades. The ministries that excite me the most are the ones that invade the walls of Hades, and they embody the life of God among the dead. So whether that's prison ministry or wherever you are at, for me this is the descent aspect of it. However, we proclaim not just Christ crucified, but Christ resurrected. So how do we embody that whole narrative? Our ministries should be kind of paintings, sketches, embodiments of the story of salvation. There's descent and there's ascent. The church can live out resurrection, exodus from death, like in those old paintings. Jesus does this once again, even before his own death and resurrection. The central story of Lazarus. We as a church believe in resurrection. But if we believe in literal resurrection, I was talking about this with Bob a week or two ago, that this isn't an either or. Some communities say, we don't we don't really believe in the resurrection of the dead. That's just a metaphor for some of these social aspects of resurrection. That I don't want to pit those against one another. That I really believe in the resurrection of the dead. And oftentimes, as a more conservative Orthodox belief, that's a, what do you say? No compromise on that. Like, that's no negotiating. Belief in the resurrection of the dead. So, if we believe in the resurrection of the literally dead, if you really believe someone who is dead, who is cold and in the morgue, if you believe that God can raise the dead, well, then raising the socially dead shouldn't be a real big hang-up for the church. A church that proclaims a God who raises the literal dead, all right, great. I want to see that in my life too. I've prayed for 2 dead people. They didn't raise, but I still want to keep praying for them. How much more with people who are not yet literally dead? We believe people can change. The center of the Christian hope, Dostoevsky writes, is the regeneration of man. That we can change if we're like dead and violent and messed up and have mental illness and trauma, that Christ can resurrect the human being. If they can be cold and dead in the morgue and be raised, how much more those who are in social tombs? So I believe the church should be a lot more involved in release and re-entry. This is resurrection. If we believe in resurrection, I think churches should be all involved in this somehow. So we would believe in resurrection means we do re-entry. And this is a model that I've been developing for a little bit. Anne, did you pass those out? Can we get some help with Anne to pass these out? This is something I've been working on for a little bit with some other folks at Tier Nueva, to go what used to be just a sermon to kind of a template for a kind of re-entry and ministry model. And if it's helpful for you, I encourage you to kind of reshape it and use it in your own communities. Really looking at kind of, other than Jesus' death and resurrection, the resurrection story of Lazarus, which is a long one. I forgot about that when I tried to preach out of it quickly somewhere a few weeks ago. I'm like, oh no, you can't do this quickly. This takes up like 2 pages in my Bible. It's a long, very important story in John's witness. And I kind of take it as a play-by-play for what resurrection can look like. Or a model for holistic re-entry resurrection today. Would someone care to read just the beginning of on the first side, where it says, we believe in resurrection? I'll describe how I use this with folks. I've been using it a lot in the last 2 months. But this is a way even to tell a Bible story, to do Bible study, to situate someone's life inside the hope of resurrection. I'll sit down and be like, hey, check this out. Just read out loud with me. And they'll read this. Someone want to read it nice and loud?
We believe in resurrection. Jesus raised people from the dead. One man, Lazarus, was buried in a dark tomb with a heavy stone blocking the entrance. Jesus spoke Lazarus' name and brought him to life, while he was still in the darkness. Jesus then told other people around him to help by rolling away the heavy stone so the new Lazarus could come out into the light. It's possible that the fact that you are here is a sign that Jesus has already been calling your name in the darkness. We believe God is not only raising people from the underground, darkness of addiction, incarceration, debt, crime, and shame, but that we are called to help roll away all of society's heavy barriers, which keep them in the darkness.
Right. And so most folks I've just read that with right away get it. And so what I've been talking about so far is the underground part, how the church helps those who are dead hear Jesus calling their name. It might happen just spiritually, mystically, Jesus just calling their name when they're in their cells, maybe, or they're in like a motel on meth. In these underground places, God is speaking their name, and we just help that proclamation of how God can raise the dead. So Jesus does this with Lazarus while he's still in the tomb, right? But that's not enough. And I think if Lazarus was just raised from the dead in the darkness there, but still wrapped up like a mummy, and then bumping his head into a huge stone and around the dead and all the stench, that would be a pretty terrifying, disorienting experience, for me at least. And I think that helps me imagine the thousands of people we as chaplains have accompanied who come to life spiritually, and yet they bump against all the barriers keeping them in the realm of the dead. Not only that they can't get out of jail or prison, or once they get out, all the barriers that we'll go over in a minute that keep them stuck keep them stuck, unable to really enter the realm of the living. And so it's better to just go back to being dead as opposed to being cursed with coming alive, but being stuck among the dead. So I think proclaiming resurrection and visiting the dead has to go hand in hand with a more holistic process of resurrection and removing barriers. Otherwise, it's just tragic to see people come alive and be stuck in the darkness. So Jesus spoke Lazarus' name into the tomb, into the darkness. And I like those images side by side. Those ancient catacombs, they look so much like a cell block in a prison. So Jesus in the community meets Lazarus at the gates. That's the next thing.
Amen.
And so I like those two images together. So that was me and my friend Holly, who wrote a lot of letters with Nieners while he was down and brought his daughters to visit him as well. We were there the morning that he was released. So many guys go back within 24 hours. It's such a terrifying experience to come out of prison and have a world not want you and not know where to go and barely being able to walk. They just go right back to the old dark comforts. So being with people upon their release day is key. Here's another guy, and I took him to a lake that was kind of pretty. I said, hey, let's not just go right to the restaurants and back to the streets. Let's go kick it out of the lake for a while. He liked it. So once they get out, working on, and this template we're building is a way to start to identify what those stones are. Jesus says to the community, the stones don't just magically, if you just pray, the stone just moves away. I think we've seen that in a few really neat ways. Bob probably told you some neat stories where just through prayer and intercession, some really great things happen in courts, legal miracles. But so often Jesus says, hey, just ordinary people, we don't even know their names, roll away the stone. Use your normal human strength to move these really heavy man-made barriers that are in the way. Because I just did something miraculous, get the stone out of the way. Lazarus can't move the stone on his own. He needs a community of people pushing against them. So here's some of them. They're listed on that sheet. Courts, collections, all those fines folks owe. If you're behind on your fines, then you can't get a driver's license. And then with a felony record, it's hard to get a job. Then you've got all those child support payments. Oh yeah, I've got to get to treatment. How do I get there? I don't have my driver's license or a car. If I got to go to treatment and all those meetings, I eventually lose my job. It's so hard to get housing, not only the felony record, but to move into a place. Just as you walk with people, you see that even if they got together their income for $900 a month to move into a place, oh yeah, you need first and last month's and deposit. How in the world are they going to get $3,000 off the bat? So they're not going to get housing. Boom, back to the underground. I believe that this system is not accidental. It works perfectly to keep the dead among the dead. That stone wasn't just a natural phenomenon that happened to fall over the hole into the tomb. That stone was carved and shaped and rolled there to keep the dead among the dead. And these are the stones our society has. My anger's been cooled a little bit when I think about, well, the stones are there for a reason. The dead normally don't come back from the dead. And so you want a heavy barrier, kind of separating those terrifying realms of the dead and the living. Oftentimes, men and women, their lives don't come into regeneration. And so society has slowly shaped and sculpted these barriers to keep folks from coming back because they're not used to seeing folks raised from the dead. We as Christians, we believe that the odd thing of resurrection does indeed happen. And so it kind of helps me not be so angry at these stones and barriers, but to be like, well, we're doing something weird. We work with a very weird living God who is changing the dead. And so, well, this stone is now not helpful anymore. We're going to move it. And as that attitude shift has happened to me, it's helped me not be so kind of like just a punk with a lot of the folks in the courts and the clerk's offices. But I'm helping invite them into maybe a story they haven't seen yet about someone come back and pay all their fines. And someone with tattoos all on their face, smile at them and come with their kids 8 months in a row and paying their fines and have a job. So it's kind of an evangelical process to invite even the stone carvers into helping those stones roll back and forth maybe a little bit more easily because maybe more dead people are coming back to life because God is alive. So walking with people to remove the stones. Oh, stones is another way of, we talked about chaplaincy is to find the gates of Hades. Now on their way out, we're still looking at the gates of Hades. This is just the backside of the gates of Hades. Advocacy and accompaniment. This is a way that I'm trying to integrate so much of the work that we do at Tierra Nueva into one narrative. Rolling away the stones happens through advocacy and accompaniment. Not being an expert, but going with them to their job, going housing search, job search, courts, collections. Not being an expert, just going with them, using your strength, your driver's license, your love, your time, your prayer, your presence beside them helps these things slowly roll away. Walking alongside people through the system, facing their barriers together, rolling away their stones. Having a list like that is so hopeful. The more I've been doing this, not just in my head as a background metaphor to motivate me, but inviting people into this story and identifying what their stones are together as they check some of those off and then right to the right, okay, here's the collections place where it is, here's how much I owe, here's what's going on my CPS case. They just then sketch the outline of the stone that's in their way. And I'm surprised by how many guys actually get really excited. Now, I always think they're going to be overwhelmed, like, oh, look at all those things in my way. Once they write them down and check them off, it's like, oh, I'm not crazy. I'm not retarded or incompetent that I can't move forward. This is the stuff in my way. Yeah, it's a lot of stuff. But now I've got someone that's helping me turn a flashlight on and look at the shape of that stone and saying, hey, you're part of a community that wants to help you roll these stones away if you want to do that with us. Like, all right, I see their hope really rise, which is surprising me. So we are privileged to be so close to resurrection, crossing society's thresholds. This is the larger motivation story for me, not just doing some hack social work on the side outside of church, but this is the cosmic story that we get to do. This is the Exodus. This is the ascent work. But as we sketch what the stone is in their way, what's the last sentence on the bottom of the page there?
Discovering who they are.
Just the last line, the handout that I made.
It also takes courage to
Oh.
Go ahead and read it nice and loud.
It also takes courage to step out of the underground into the light. We are here to stand with you.
I added that a month or so ago when I realized, oh yeah, I've done a lot of stone rolling away with folks who then, I'm not sure they ever really wanted to step into the land of the living. I don't totally blame them, it's terrifying. But this is the part where I'm saying, hey, I can help roll the stones away with you. But then there's going to come that terrifying point, bro, where you're going to have to see if you want to step out into the light, into a world that does not want you, that you experience does not want you. We're going to be there with you, but I'm not going to carry you out. You need to walk out. And Lazarus does indeed walk out into the community. And that's got to be a terrifying experience. I haven't experienced it myself, but that is an important step. And then when they come out, this is, if you want to flip it over, I have them read the next spot. Someone new want to read that paragraph on the top of the backside?
Layers, is that what you want to read?
Yep.
Layers. Jesus then told the others to help Lazarus peel off the layers of the death trappings, like a mummy's. The Genesis process and our weekly meetings with TN pastor staff for inner healing prayer and conversations are ways to slowly, respectfully remove the layers of anger and shame and relationship patterns in our hearts that wrapped us up in the darkness. Maybe they served us well, protected us in the darkness, but now they're getting in the way. What do you think some of those layers would be inside you and your story?
And so there's some suggestions there. It used to just be blank lines and be like, gosh, I don't know. But as folks look through some of those, they go, oh yeah, violence. Check that one off. Tell me about that. What does violence look like for you? And then a conversation begins. And I haven't invited them to commit to anything yet. They're just sketching out their story. What are the death wrappings around them? And I really like this image because it's not saying, hey, I want to change you. You got to stop being so violent. You got to really change you. There's a lot of sense of becoming something you're not and a fear of that. I love the image of the layers, though, because the true Lazarus is underneath that. Maybe he's had those layers on for so long. But the idea of removing layers is not saying, hey, I want to change you. It's saying, God is the one resurrecting you. God is calling your name. I just get to help roll away stones and help remove sensitive stuff to maybe reveal the true you. Yeah?
At what place of your relationship are you introducing this? Is it like an intake for you? Or?
Good question. The downside of having something written out is it can feel really programmatic, and we're just getting yet another piece of paper and a form out. The way I've been introducing this lately is with folks that I've known for a while, or maybe that are coming around. I've known for a couple of years. I love them. I've written with them. Now I'm actually mailing it off to guys in prison who are saying, hey, I really want to change my life when I get out. Can you help me? I'm always like, I guess I can't really help them until then. I can be have spiritual conversations when they get out. I can try to do a lot of reentry work. This is a way where I'm sending it off to guys in prison saying, hey, fill this out. Send it back to me to start the conversation for them to think about their stones and their layers. Or guys coming to me saying, hey, can I get a job? Can I get some tattoos removed? Maybe just one thing that they're identifying their need is. I'll sit down. I'm learning not to tell them over the phone to make it sound like there's conditions. To be like, hey, that sounds great. Let's meet up next week. I'll normally bring this out and be like, hey, this is something I've made, so I'm not trying to intimidate them with paper. I'm like, hey, this is something I'm working on. Let's just read this together. And as we go through it, the paper just holds a conversation. It's a project of the imagination for them to imagine themselves in a much larger process. Like, hey, the pastor is just going to help me get some tattoos removed, or the pastor is going to help me just go pay some rent stuff, and be like, hey, I believe in a much larger resurrection for you.
This is the context for what.
Yeah, so maybe God's actually raising you from the dead. So right away, I've now moved them in a realm of pastoral spiritual direction and not just doing like charity work. And maybe that tattoo or that rent housing, that's part of a larger, huge stone in your way. What more is there in the way? And so back on the front side, oftentimes I ask them, what are your dreams? What are your goals? If God's really bringing you back from the dead, beyond just your rent getting paid, beyond maybe you getting off of probation, if God was really totally resurrecting you, what could the rest of your life look like? And that's my favorite part of the conversation. Normally it starts with, well, I just want to have a normal life. Okay, what does that mean? I want to have my kids live with me. You want to be a father? Yeah. All right, write that down. And they write it down. And they see themselves really write down their dreams. All right, what else would you want? Have your kids back. Oh, I want to get a job. All right, cool. Write that down. I want to be married like you, bro. Okay, yeah, marriage is hard, but I think it's beautiful. All right, write that down. Be married. To a healthy hyena. Okay, healthy. One that loves God. All right, write that down. So then now that you're married and you've got kids, well, what else? What is God's call on your life? I feel like I want to help kids one day. All right, cool. Write that down. How do you want to help them? Well, I like art. Okay, write that down. And so they start sketching out maybe something that I trust and I'm hoping that God is the one breathing these visions into them. And that's a really nice opportunity if they're ready for prayer, to just say, to do prophetic prayer. God, what are you calling this person, this man, or this woman into? And then be able to write down very seriously what God is prophetically speaking right there for their lives. And then to say, okay, now the hard work, the stones and the layers. If this is your calling, what's in the way? I'm willing to help you. So it's helping me offer so much more to folks instead of having such a yearning as a pastor to do so much work with folks and just doing just little one-off motels or visiting them in the hospital, to invite them into a much richer process they didn't know I could really offer. It's not like you walk in and there's a big menu oftentimes, like, hey, we can offer you this, this, this. This becomes a kind of spiritual menu of what God can be doing in their lives, and yet very specifically things that we can be working on. Yeah?
Do you ever have guys that you work with that want like the relationship and friendship with you but don't want like the spiritual aspect at all? Or do you feel like they just come in with that expectation of becoming a pastor that they're going to receive that and they're okay?
Good question. Did everyone hear that? Does everyone who engages in relationship with me or our colleagues wanting the spiritual aspect, or just the help or the assistance or the benefits we can offer? I'd say every guy's a little bit different, but this is a way that helps clarify, this is who I am. I'm a pastor. This is what I believe in. And I like that first sentence. We believe in resurrection. And so this is the door you step through, bro. I'm someone who believes in resurrection. And having this conversation is a really nice way for me not to, for years I think I would try to build trust by being kind of pseudo-friends for a while. They're like, hey, yeah, let's hang out. But in the back of my mind, I've kind of got an agenda. I think it's a good agenda to help them with so much stuff, but I don't know how to offer it all. So I'm kind of being friends. I want to pray for them. I don't know if they want prayer. Some guys, it's easiest when folks really want prayer. And they're like, hey, I'm reading my Bible. I really want to change my life. I want to come to church more. There's a lot of fun there. It's a little trickier. And this is what's helping me now to be with folks who say, hey, this is something I believe. And I almost don't need them to believe it yet. And that's what I like about this, is it doesn't say you need to believe. It kind of it kind of holds them in a larger communal faith that I think oftentimes imbues them with faith as they step into it. That they know, I'm going to pray for you. I believe that God is doing something. And especially that sentence where it says, the fact that you're here is maybe a sign that God's already calling your name in the darkness. I've sensed that that's a way to help them into imagining something that Bob's oftentimes doing in the Reading the Bible with the Damned questions, of helping people reflect who maybe have considered themselves damned, that they're not part of the church, they think they're not part of religion, and then you really look at how God calls people in the scriptures. And have you ever had that happen? And oftentimes guys will say to Bob's office, oh yeah, that's happened. So Bob is getting people to reflect spiritually. Maybe God is already active in your life. That's not required on, hey, I'm trying to pitch you this story and you need to purchase with a belief statement right now. But maybe God's already doing something before he even got your consent. He loves you that much. Is that helpful? And so as I go through this with guys, maybe they'll be like, yeah, do I like have to believe everything? And I'll be like, I don't know, you might start believing, but I believe in it, and this is what I want to do with you if you want to. So by the time we get through the stones and the layers and having them kind of imagine what those layers are, which, by the way, you don't know what all the layers will be. Oftentimes it takes months walking with someone through their stones and not right away get into the layer stuff. It's only after Lazarus steps into the light do you see all the mummy wrappings, right? So for a lot of guys, it builds trust going through their courts with them, paying stuff off, walking alongside them. That is how you build trust, not just by finding ways to hang out and have coffee every once in a while if they're free, but as you sit in court with them, as you drive them to appointments, as you get a credit card out and maybe pay off a fine with them. That is the trust-building stuff that when it comes time to peel off those things that hurt like Band-Aids coming off, talking about their stories and their trauma, they trust you because you've rolled away big, heavy stones that no one else has.
I love this, man. I've seen a lot of fruit with what you've been doing ever since I met you, and this is just a really, I believe this is a very perfect way to remind them and to remember who they are and not forget. Especially when they're going through chaos, you can say, hey, look, man, you can always remember what they wrote down, and it's very useful. So I love it.
Yeah, I've been really excited about it because it's a way also for me to remember and keep track of the whole picture. Oftentimes I can be like, oh yeah, I went to court with that person and I got to pray with them once, and I get so scattered. But I now have a little file system in my bag with like 4 or 5 different guys that I have their stones and layer sheet. So when I meet with them, if they want to agree after we go through this, I say, hey, look, you don't have to do anything with me. We can just do your one thing, but I'm offering to walk through this whole process with you. It's going to take a lot of work, and so will you meet with me once a week to work on your stones and layers? Oftentimes I'll just catch up, I'll pray with them, we'll work on, okay, we got to be calling collections or child support, we'll get a little bit done, and within that 1 hour, chipping away at a little bit of all of it. And then when I see them next week, I've got almost like a log, a progress log, to kind of find where we're at. So I'm not just forgetting. Lots of times I think just by busyness and forgetfulness, I've neglected so many stories of resurrection that could have been completed. Has anyone else had that experience? You just kind of get overwhelmed and you kind of forget the details of someone's story, like who's keeping track of it, because we don't want to think like social workers or case workers, but this is a really lightweight document for me that helps me keep track of what we together identified, to come back and be like, hey man, man, nothing's changing in my mind. No, look at this, like you got your license, you're halfway through these courts. We've talked a lot about stuff that happened when you were a kid, and are you feeling as angry these days? Well, not so much. So it's also a way to track, like, yeah, you're not fully in the land of the living, but God's at work. Let's keep going. Were you going to say something? Okay.
Just one question. Is this, I guess, like, I'm sure it could be adapted, but do you do this mostly with guys coming out of jail or out of, like, heavy street involvement? Or is this something that you've also used with people who are maybe not, like, totally, like, deep into gangs or something, but just maybe just kind of really angry and drinking a lot or whatever, and just like have some bad relationship issues? And
I think it can work with a lot of folks if they identify with being kind of dead and in the underground in any way.
Yeah.
I've only started using this only like last 2 or 3 months, but in the meantime, I guess I've been doing it with Nieners the most intensively, more than anyone I've ever worked with. But a lot of the guys most recently I've been working with are not fully coming out of prison. Some of them have been locked up, but they're kind of still in that underground, that kind of Jim Crow status, that kind of underworld that Michelle Alexander talks about. They've got felonies, they're in the criminal shadows, they have no hope for moving forward. Maybe they want to get a job. And so we attached it to one guy who got a job at our New Earth Gardens. It was much more motivating to offer a job to someone if they said, hey, part of our interview process is to look at the stones and layers. Do you want to do this? Because we created this job to assist someone going through this resurrection process. Is that what you want? And it was like, oh, I thought I just wanted a job, but yeah. Another guy was just asking for help going through all his courts. And so now he's doing this as well. Little Alex is doing this, who you met yesterday. And so he wanted to get involved in underground coffee, and he's actually not young enough to put on payroll. So we said, your hours in underground coffee, we can shift those over to gang ministry and help tally up the hours to buy lowrider parts, because where are we going to get the money to buy all these lowrider parts on the bikes he's working on? So we can give this little job, but look, Alex, this isn't just a job. Like, all jobs, everyone involved in underground coffee now is doing their stones and layers, because we don't just want to give jobs. We lose our motivation after a while. It's like, we want to see so much restoration. We don't just want to haggle over paychecks. We want that to be an assistance in this larger process of coming out of the underground. So what are the other things in your way? And so, Alex is starting his stones and his layers with us. For him, it's getting back into school and facing a lot of the scholastic and language barriers in his way. And man, he's going a lot deeper in the layer stuff than I thought that 15-year-old was ready to. I'm so encouraged. Yesterday, after he left here and being with everybody, you should have seen the stuff he was reflecting on the way home. So I think those layers are slowly coming off. Did you have a question, Rebecca?
Yeah, I just was wondering if you could talk about the importance of resurrection with Christ happening first. Like sometimes, in ministry, there's a temptation to start working on all the stones and layer stuff before Christ has already done the work of resurrecting. It won't work if the person's still dead in the tomb,
Amen. I think that's the biggest error of mine that I'm constantly committing. Is this is helps always push me back into, I'm not raising people from the dead. Mm-hmm. And unless God raises this person from the dead, this is just going to be a whole lot of sweat and frustration, dragging the dead out and being like, wake up, and trying to roll the stone, and you're not walking. And why is the rest of the community totally bothered by your stench? Realizing maybe they're still dead, and God needs to raise this person first. And so this tool is actually coming full circle and whiplashing against me as a way of doing spiritual direction of, Chris, this is why you're so burnt out. You believe in resurrection, but you don't believe enough and are not in touch enough with the living God who has to raise them first. So it kind of relieves me that I don't have to vacate the tombs of all the dead. I have to wait upon a living God to raise their bud from the dead and to speak that mystical, holy spark into their souls that I cannot do. And I feel kind of I'm preaching to myself right now, oh yeah, then it's not my fault if the dead are still dead. And I can't just slap them awake and be like, look, we rolled away all these stones. I mean, they never heard God's name spoken in the darkness of their situation, of their hearts. And so this restores me back to my role is in the community. I need to really be listening to Jesus, because they weren't just activists rolling away stones. They were Jesus' community saying, if Jesus has rolled away the stones for this person, we're on it. So it really makes me want to be more dialed into, Jesus, who are you truly calling back from the dead? Who do I need to do this work for and with? Does that help, Rebecca?
Sorry, what?
Rebecca, does that help?
Yeah.
Cool. 2 questions. Start with Mike.
So, what are the signs that you look for? How do you hear them sort of knocking against the coffin door? How do you recognize when somebody's coming alive versus still dead?
I think without going into too deep of spiritual discernment, which I think I need to go a lot more deeper into, some of the most just obvious signs for me is when someone's calling a lot and when someone's showing up and saying, hey, I want help. Like when Zach got out of Bob's Bible study, he was like, hey, I want to be part of your ministry. I want to come. And they're not just coming to church on Sundays. That's great. But someone like, I want to get involved in your ministry. Or they're just asking for help a lot with one thing, but you can kind of sense, you're like, hey, can I pray for you? Yeah. That there's a certain aliveness that's emerging, whereas sometimes I don't even wait for that. I just like someone so much. I like so many dead people that I'm just dragging them out all the time, but I don't think they're really hearing God speaking to their soul. But I'm not, I guess I still interpret God calling someone's name in the darkness in a way that's deeper than just them consciously being like, I believe in God, I want to go to church. Oftentimes there's a deeper spiritual regeneration happening that I think requires certain participation of the Holy Spirit. Back here.
What's the word when it echoes something?
Resonates?
You just said, just reverberated, because I believe that there's a dance there that's happening, and the Holy Spirit and the person in you and God around that. And so with something, I'm a social worker, so I'm very familiar in some ways with this, and I understand the dangers. But sometimes the speaking
Right. One more danger, I think, though, is without an understanding of stones and layers, we can see so many people really want to change their life and really show a lot of signs of resurrection, and then they go back. And then people in the community can so easily say, oh, well, they weren't really wanting to change. They didn't really want it enough. Like, no, if you're dead and there's a stones in the way and you're all bound up, you're not going to make it forward. So there's a burden on the community as well to be attentive to and participating with resurrection. And so they have to want it. It's both, right? God has to be doing it. They have to want it and participate in their coming alive. And we need to remove the barriers. Otherwise, God is just bumping dead people's heads against the gates of Hades. So these are just some examples, as you see on the sheet. Anger, resentments, gang mentality, addiction, anxiety, violence, trauma, mistrust, self-contempt, racism. There's a lot of layers. And back to patience yesterday. This isn't going to happen in 2 or 3 prayer appointments. It's going to take some time. And it's about coming together. It's about being in prayer together. The Genesis process is one tool. It doesn't work for everybody. I really like it. Some people really want to step into it, and they really enjoy having a booklet and homework and very clear things to fill out. Some folks aren't ready for that. For them, school is really about rejection, and you're not good enough, and I can't fill out paperwork. So if we've gone through the Genesis process, we can learn some of those tools as a way of getting at the core wound and talking about the behaviors and the addictions and the compulsions and the triggers that make them want to wrap themselves up in their numbing behaviors. So alongside Genesis process, this is a way for me to invite folks into so much of what we prepare for here at Tierra Nueva, but seldom do I get to really do with folks, really extended inner healing prayer. Doing deliverance prayer, where folks identify that there's some stuff that's not just psychological, some really demonic spiritual strongholds that need to be identified and prayed through in ways that Bob has really explored and helped equip us for at Tierra Nueva. My main frustration has not been doubt about the need for deliverance, but I have a really hard time finding the most bound up people who are willing to come, identify it, and sit in a chair and be willing to go through it. It's a really intensive process that requires calling out their faith in Jesus in the midst of their bondage. And so for me, the stones and layers is a way to integrate the social worky stuff, the accompaniment through their courts, as well as, hey, there's need for some deeper stuff. Can we keep meeting one-on-one? And you start praying with someone and things get identified and say, hey, would you be interested? I've yet to do this, but I really want to. Actually, I've done it over the years, but I haven't done it with the Stones and Layers document. Be like, hey, would you want to do like a more intensive prayer appointment with one of our other pastors on staff? And maybe there's some strongholds there inside you that it's not just about your willpower. And maybe we really want to invite in spiritual warfare the power of Jesus to really cut and liberate you from a oppressor inside. Would you want to do that? And so it's a way to hold the holistic ministry for transformational ministry on the margins. For me, all of that, how do we offer all of it? And this is a way that I'm working on to getting it all together and inviting them into the whole smorgasbord. I got like 1 minute left. So there's Nieners yesterday was talking about being on the bell choir. He hasn't gone for months. But it sure is cool. Hopefully a holiday season he'll get back on. That he's involved in another church. And my hope is not to get just people at Tierra Nueva, but there's so many churches in this community who can't do the intensive stones and layers work, but people need to be part of a faith community. And churches need to be re-entry communities, like the Underground Railroad. They need to be refuges who are ready and waiting at the door to welcome people out of prisons, out of addiction. And so I want to partner with more churches. Like this guy, Howard on the right. I never would have thought to have him work with gang leaders, but they get along just great. Howard's there on the right, helping him with the bass bell. So they bonded through that. So now Nieners is joining us in a community of going back to the underground once again. As our community grows, we can roll away stones even more. As more and more Lazaruses come out, they can join us in actually knowing exactly what the stones look like, how the layers feel. And so that hopefully the community builds. So Nieners is writing so many letters to so many guys that he knows out there. That's just one guy, Pablo. Prison letters, once again. Guys coming out, a community of Lazaruses. So in summary, mission of the church. Before we were just talking about the specific issue of prisons and how to engage prisons, the central mission of the church, from Jesus' founding statement, it is something that invades the gates of Hades and the underworld. This is what we are about, no matter what ministry we do. And if we can see prison as one of the most clear embodiments of Hades, of the underworld, the place of death, then the church is that which goes with Christ into Hades, into the underground. And then always attaching that to resurrection, descent and ascent. Resurrection as re-entry. And resurrection is a really exciting idea, and re-entry is not for a lot of people. It's just such hard work doing re-entry. But if we can pair that with resurrection, I think we should. That animates me. I want to be about resurrection. So I got to get back on working on that collections bills with those guys, because that is in the way. And so, closing with not just Jesus' descent and the church's descent and resurrection, but Lazarus as a really helpful, slow-mo, iconic story of resurrection to help us identify really concrete ways that we can remove the social obstacles and walk through the inner healing and resurrection, unbinding the newly alive. That's it. We kind of like did Q&A as we went, and so I'm comfortable kind of closing there, unless we have one more question. Yes, you went.
It's not a question, but on the stones, I think this is a great opportunity to get the body of Christ involved, because everybody's not called to prison ministry.
Yes.
But to bring the church in and develop a network of people that will hire color.
Yep.
Housing that will welcome in sex offenders, whatever.
Yeah, good one.
Then your body is involved in this.
I believe that's how our churches will grow as well,
Yeah.
with Lazarus's. And to what was your name again?
Chris.
Well, what Chris was saying yesterday, that, and when Ninos was encouraging him, like, you can't do everything, we need a community. Maybe just your role is being among the dead, being in the underground, but pairing with a Lazarus community on the outside.
Yeah.
So that's a way that we can see us working together. Well, let me just close with some prayer. And what I'd like to do is just guide us into at least just 1 or 2 minutes of silence. And this is the way I'm helping integrate for myself like some contemplative prayer practices of going into the underground inside me as well. The darkness or the scarier places, and not just staying in my head with lots of wordy prayers. Lord Jesus Christ, thank you that your goal is to break through the gates of Hades in society and inside us. We welcome you now with some space of silence to you speak to us. If any of this presentation is something that you want to speak to us, be burdened with a lot of these class after class after class. We need you to sort it out and put the pieces together inside. So Lord Jesus, speak our names into our darkness right now. Praying, I feel that some of you feel very dead, and that's why you came to this course inside and you hide it from your colleagues. And that maybe God has already been speaking your name and doing the same underground work in you. And to acknowledge that deadness inside. That God loves being among the dead, and to not be afraid to go there in your heart and your weary soul. Christ is risen from the dead, trampling down death by death, and upon those in the graves bestowing life. Yes, Lord, help us proclaim from our depths, you, Christ, are risen from the dead, trampling down death by death, the gates of Hades by death and life, and upon those in the grave